Okay, I thought this could be an interesting idea for a video. So, one thing I talk about a lot on this channel is the difference between turnovers and really interceptions versus turnover worthy plays. I think a lot of times people will get the wrong idea about a specific quarterback simply by looking at their turnover numbers at the end of the year. And listen, the best way to evaluate a quarterback is to watch the quarterback play, right? I still think that good old-fashioned film study is the best way to evaluate someone. That's why that's still most of what I do on this channel. However, I do think that if you want to use stats, looking at turnover-worthy plays is important, and I think comparing that to interceptions can sometimes give you an idea of why people have very different opinions about specific players. So I figured let's go through, let's talk about all the key quarterbacks and compare their turnover-worthy plays versus their actual interceptions. I'm only going to use interceptions instead of turnovers because people don't really use turnovers. People tend to use interceptions instead and not talk about fumbles. It is worth noting turnover-worthy plays do include fumbles as well, they include fumbles as well. So that's worth mentioning. But I guess real quick, if you don't know what a turnover-worthy play is, I'll explain that quickly before we get into the list. It is a subjective stat. It is PFF graders. They look at a specific play, and if they deem it to be worthy of a turnover, it counts as a turnover-worthy play. Simple enough, right? Because it's graders, you can get some subjectivity in the mix. There could be a play that I consider turnover-worthy that you don't. That does happen sometimes. But ultimately, again, I don't think the goal is perfection here. Just the goal is to make a better stat than what we currently have, and I do think they have successfully done that. So, okay, let's get into the chart. Let's start off with just the players who have gotten lucky last year. These are the 6 players who had the highest differential from turnover-worthy plays to interceptions, as in the guys who were constantly putting the ball in harm's way, but maybe not always getting burned by it. Matthew Stafford leads the reign here, and I actually do kind of agree with this. I was surprised when I saw he only had 8 interceptions last year, because he's a gunslinger. He puts the ball in harm's way. Thought he did a great job in the playoffs, even though he still put the ball in harm's way there, of also being able to make plays. He's Stafford. It's what he does, right? But I do kind of agree with that. Darnold, also a guy who was maybe a bit on the lucky side with that stuff last year. Then a couple players I think are really worth talking about. Jalen Hurts, this absolutely checks out. Again, I think that the 5 interception totals is making people feel a little bit better about what he did last year than what he actually might do this upcoming season, although I could be wrong. Still mostly pro Jalen Hurts. Hey, he played great in the conference championship game and Super Bowl, but this could color some people's opinions. Caleb Williams, the narrative with him was he wasn't putting the ball in harm's way. That's kind of the one thing he did well as a rookie, but according to this, maybe not quite as well as people realize. Herbert's another guy where, again, the whole narrative is he threw more interceptions in the one playoff game than he did all season, but he is someone who will take a chance here and there as well, and it seems like those chances kind of came around and burned him in that playoff game. Again, it's worth mentioning for some of these, like, it's not horrible numbers, like 19 and 16 for Hurts, Caleb Williams, and Herbert, and Josh Allen, who we'll get to in a second. Those aren't horrible numbers, but given the very low interception totals, it perhaps made people think that they were actually better at protecting the football, when in reality they were like solid at protecting the football. Allen definitely has to be talked about here because he won MVP last year, and a big part of it was, well, hey, you get all these positives, and he only threw 6 interceptions, but he did throw more turnover-worthy plays, and I think that 2 years ago, a knock against him was he was actually very unlucky in turnover-worthy plays, so he had a lot of turnovers, and that's part of why he wasn't in the MVP discussion 2 years ago when I said, I was saying at the time he should have been. Here, I think kind of the opposite happened, so hey, I guess, it worked out for him at the end of the day. He still got the MVP that he deserved, maybe just the wrong year, in my opinion, but I think that is worth noting. We'll plow through now for some of these next couple of charts. These are kind of the players who had some luck, because, again, you usually get some luck. In fact, every player we're going to talk about here is in the situation where they had more turnover-worthy plays than interceptions. Doesn't have to always go that way, but here it is going that way. But you see, like Jared Goff, CJ Stroud, Patrick Mahomes, Spencer Rattler, who not playing it a lot, still somehow ended up racking up a big difference there. Kirk Cousins, Baker Mayfield, and Dak Prescott. Again, some of these guys like Cousins and Mayfield were high in both turnover-worthy play and interceptions, which kind of makes some sense. right? For like 8 and 9, there's definitely still some luck here. I think these guys definitely got away with 1 or 2 here, but we're in more of kind of the reasonable range of like what you can kind of expect for some quarterbacks to get. Anything higher than this is like surprising luck, I guess. This next chart, the biggest of which, this is just guys with 6 or 5 difference. This is probably the range where you would say is like the average amount of luck you get in a season. So I won't go through each of these. You can look at them if you want to see where your player ranked. I can talk about a couple. Like I think Lamar Jackson being +6 is interesting because like he did have some luck. And what's interesting is, some of his interceptions weren't actually turnover-worthy plays. That can happen where you throw it, hits off a receiver's hands, and then goes to someone else and gets intercepted. So a lot of people will look at the 4 interceptions and say, honestly, he maybe should have only had 1 or 2 interceptions last year. He did have some other plays that he got lucky on, right? So it's not quite that fair. But ultimately, like 10 turnover-worthy plays in a season is pretty crazy, especially when you factor in the positives that he gives you. So still very good. But yeah, that's probably the one worth talking about here. Everything else is kind of what you would expect, I think. Final chart here. These are the players who, usually get some luck. These players just didn't get that kind of luck this year. Seems like when they threw one in harm's way, they got burned by it. Didn't get those dropped interceptions that you usually like. So Joe Flacco's on the list. Geno Smith is actually really interesting. Really him and Anthony Richardson, both of them, because Smith had 15 interceptions last year. That sounds like a ton of interceptions, but only 18 turnover-worthy plays. So while he, again, was somewhat in the section of would put the ball in harm's way, like Josh Allen had the same amount of turnover-worthy plays, but he had 9 different interceptions. So people are going to say Geno Smith did a much worse job than Allen did. And again, not all turnover-worthy plays are created equal, right? But still, it is notable. And Anthony Richardson, his whole narrative was turning the ball over, and completion percentage under 50%. But, again, 15 turnover-worthy plays for his time playing. You would like to get that lower. Smith would like to get his lower, but it's not like it's a disaster either. But, again, I think the other stuff with Richardson was also worth noting. Bryce Young and Jaden Daniels both were pretty good. 12 turnover-worthy plays. Now, Young missed some time, but still, both 9 interceptions, though. So, again, when they put the ball in harm's way, they kind of got burned. Russell Wilson, also really interestingly, only 7 turnover-worthy plays last year. Again, he missed a chunk of time with Fields starting the season, but still, unfortunately for him, though, 5 interceptions, and maybe he doesn't get the credit you would hope if you had maybe 3 interceptions instead, right? Bo Nix and Aaron Rodgers both ended up getting the least luck on the year of only a difference of 1. Both of these guys actually did an actively good job at protecting the football last year, but the interception totals wouldn't necessarily show that. So with Rodgers, that also kind of makes some sense because he's always been pretty good at protecting the football, but then like 11 interceptions last year was like, whoa, what happened? Well, maybe he just didn't get the breaks that you usually get throughout the course of an NFL season. So yeah, ultimately some interesting stuff here. Again, it's just one season, and the one thing I would always say is, so I'm going to make a baseball comparison, and for that I apologize in advance, but there's something called batting average on balls in play. If you're a baseball fan, you probably know what I'm talking about. But essentially, the logic was, smart people realized when they would go through numbers and look at how often a guy hits the ball in play, the batting average tends to be about the same, around I think it's like 300 to 350, somewhere around there. But throughout the course of a season, you'd get the occasional player who's hitting like 450 on batting average and balls in play. And so what they kind of realized was, well, that's not going to keep up for the rest of his career. Let's trade him now while he has more value than he probably should have. So everyone came around on that. Everyone realized, okay, batting average on balls in play, there's some luck involved. If you're hitting 200 on balls in play, then you're probably better than people realize. If you're hitting 400, you're probably worse than people realize. And so that was the logic. But then what happened is you get the occasional player who hits kind of a high-ish number on batting average on balls in play, but that's just what they did for their whole career. And people started realizing you're actually better off comparing it to that player as opposed to to the rest of the league. I'm now just realizing that was a really long tangent, so sorry if you got bored or if you clicked off the video. I guess you're not watching and don't hear my apology, but I think that's kind of the best way to look at this. So like for Aaron Rodgers, who is usually good at protecting the football, it might be fair to compare him to his previous numbers, whereas, someone like Baker Mayfield, maybe he's usually someone who's going to end up a little bit lucky, or maybe some guys are going to end up not as lucky, right? Because like I said, not all turnover-worthy plays are going to be created equal. It's impossible to say for sure, but that's something to pay attention to as well. Mahomes, throughout the course of his career, has tended to be pretty lucky on turnover-worthy plays to turnovers in that ratio. It's possible that's just part of his play style. His turnover-worthy plays aren't as worthy of turnovers as other guys, or maybe it's just luck. Hard to say. But anyway, it's an interesting topic, so I wanted to make a video on it. Let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts? Always love hearing from ya. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.